Today I'm going to show you the family tree of pharaohs from the Egyptian New Kingdom. The New Kingdom is when Egypt reached its peak of power, and it consists of dynasties 18, 19, and 20. So we're going to start with Ahmose the First, founder of the 18th dynasty, and we're going to go all the way down to Ramses the 11th, the last king of the 20th dynasty. Along the way, we'll meet some of the most well-known figures in Egyptian history, such as Queen Nefertiti, King Tut, and Ramses the Great. And keep in mind, all of this happened during the Bronze Age. So let's begin. Ahmose the First was actually a member of the previous dynasty, Dynasty 17. In fact, his father was a pharaoh before him, as well as his older brother. But Dynasty 17, which is considered part of the Second Intermediate Period, only controlled Upper Egypt. And therefore, when Ahmose the First defeated Lower Egypt, expelling the foreign Hyksos and uniting Egypt once again, the change was significant enough that Egyptologists consider him to be the start of a new dynasty, Dynasty 18. This is also the point in which the Egyptian New Kingdom is said to have begun. Ahmose was followed by his son Amenhotep I, and then by Thutmose I, who was probably his son-in-law. Now remember, we're talking about a family tree that is more than 3,500 years old, so there are going to be a few areas of uncertainty. Whenever we come across one of those areas, you'll see it marked with a small question mark. Thutmose I was the father of both Thutmose II, the next pharaoh, as well as the famous female pharaoh Hatshepsut. They had different mothers though, and therefore that makes them half-siblings. Hatshepsut started out as the great wife of Thutmose II. Egyptian pharaohs usually had many wives, but the great wife was kind of the queen consort or main wife. And although we find it pretty gross today, it was actually very common in ancient Egypt for pharaohs to marry their half-sisters and sometimes even their full sisters. Officially, the next pharaoh was the son of Thutmose II via one of his other wives. However, that son, Thutmose III, was a small child when his father died, and therefore Hatshepsut reigned as pharaoh regent and then co-pharaoh until her death. By the time Hatshepsut died, Thutmose III was an adult, and therefore at that point he began his sole reign. You can find more information about Hatshepsut by watching Cogito's video on her, which, like this video, is part of a special Bronze Age collaboration between several history YouTubers. Check the description for details. Thutmose III ended up becoming one of the most powerful pharaohs of the 18th dynasty. He's often called the Napoleon of Egypt because he greatly expanded Egypt's territory. He's also considered by some biblical literalists to be the pharaoh of the Exodus story. Now, most historians consider the Exodus to be a legend, not history, and personally I agree with them. However, those who have attempted to put together certain numbers from the Bible and calculate a literal date for the story of Moses usually wind up with a date close to the reign of Thutmose III. This despite the fact that Cecil B. DeMille in his famous movie The Ten Commandments chose Ramses the Great instead, and we'll get to Ramses shortly. Thutmose III was followed by Amenhotep II, Thutmose IV, and Amenhotep III. During the reign of Amenhotep III, Egypt reached its peak in terms of art and culture. We now come to one of the most famous couples in Egyptian history, Pharaoh Akhenaten and Queen Nefertiti. Akhenaten was the son of Amenhotep and was originally known as Amenhotep IV. However, during his reign, he did something unprecedented in the ancient world. He encouraged the worship of a single god instead of the worship of many gods. The god he chose was Aten, the sun god, and therefore he renamed himself Akhenaten, which meant spirit of Aten. Now, whether or not Akhenaten's religion can technically be considered monotheistic is something that is debated. However, it was certainly a big change at the time. So much so that after Akhenaten died and Egypt went back to its normal polytheistic religion, Akhenaten was considered a heretic, and his name was removed from most records. After Akhenaten, we get two pharaohs that are somewhat mysterious: Smenkhare and Nefer-Neferu Aten. Some experts think that these two names might actually refer to the same person, who may have been either male or female. However, others think that they are two separate pharaohs, and that Smenkhare was the husband of Meret Aten, who was the daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. That's how he's shown on this chart. As for Nefer-Neferu Aten, some experts think that that person was Meret Aten, whereas others think that it was Queen Nefertiti. On this chart, I've gone with Nefertiti, but keep in mind there's quite a bit of uncertainty about the placement of these two names. Following the two mysterious pharaohs, we get an individual whose name is much more well known: Tutankhamun, or King Tut for short. He was the son of Akhenaten. Now, King Tut was not actually a very important pharaoh as pharaohs go, but we all know his name because in the 1920s, his tomb was discovered almost entirely intact, something that is very rare in Egypt because most tombs ended up being robbed over the centuries. The mask that you see pictured here was one of the most important things that was found in his tomb. Within the last 20 years, we've learned even more about King Tut and his tomb. For example, we've learned that the burial might have been a rush job, and that the tomb may have originally been meant for Nefer-Neferu Aten. We've also learned through DNA testing that King Tut's mother was the individual who archaeologists refer to as the Younger Lady. The Younger Lady was a full sister of Akhenaten, but also one of his minor wives. We also know that King Tut suffered from several deformities and disorders, likely due to the inbreeding, and also that he suffered from malaria. What exactly caused his death is not known, but the poor guy likely only made it to about age 18. After King Tut, we get a pharaoh named Ai. Ai might have been Nefertiti's father, and he was probably also Akhenaten's uncle. He was followed by Horemheb, who was likely the son-in-law of Ai. And this is where Dynasty 18 comes to an end. Ramses I, the founder of the 19th dynasty, had originally served as Horemheb's vizier, which is kind of like a prime minister. But when Horemheb died, he became pharaoh. He was followed by his son, Seti I. Because of the instability that followed Akhenaten's reign, Egypt's territory had shrunk by this point. But Seti was able to turn things around. Then things really took off under the reign of his son, Ramses the Great, who is generally considered to be the greatest pharaoh of all time. He pushed his empire north to the borders of the Hittite Empire, as well as to the south into Nubia, achieving many great victories. He also built a new capital city and erected many colossal monuments and statues all over Egypt. The famous poem Ozymandias by Percy Bysshe Shelley is about the remains of one of those statues. Ramses had several great wives over his long 66-year reign. The first was Nefertari, who is sometimes confused with Nefertiti, but was actually a totally different person. He also married a Hittite princess as part of a peace deal with his arch-rivals. But it was through a wife named Isetnofret that his line continued. We get his son Merneptah, and then we get some conflict between several descendants, with the throne going back and forth a bit before it finally goes to a pharaoh named Setnakte. Setnakte was likely a descendant of Ramses the Great via some unknown junior branch of the family, and with him the 20th dynasty is said to have begun. He was followed by his son Ramses III, who was the greatest pharaoh of that dynasty and the last great pharaoh of the Egyptian New Kingdom. After his assassination in what has become known as the Harem Conspiracy, Egypt's power started to decline. This coincides with what is known as the Bronze Age collapse and the transition towards the Iron Age. You can see that several of Ramses' sons and grandsons followed him, all with relatively short reigns and all using the name Ramses. Eventually, this line wins out and we go all the way down to Ramses the 11th, the last pharaoh of the Egyptian New Kingdom. After him, the third intermediate period begins and Egypt is once again split in two, with Lower Egypt being ruled by Dynasty 21 and Upper Egypt being ruled by the high priests of Amun. You can see that both the initial rulers of those dynasties married daughters of Ramses the 11th. At this point, Egypt would never become as great as it once was. So that was a look at the family tree of Egyptian pharaohs from Dynasty 18, 19, and 20. For more information about how you can get a copy of this chart, please check the description. There, you'll also find a link to all the other videos that are part of this special Bronze Age collaboration. Thanks for watching.